Hi everyone, and welcome to Corrections. This will be our first lecture of quite a few this semester. And in this lecture, we're going to sort of tiptoe into the world of corrections by talking briefly about what is the correctional system. It's a term, it's a title of the class, it's a term that we throw around, but we want to make sure we have a good grasp of exactly what we're talking about. We're also going to talk a little bit about what is sort of at the core of the correctional system, and that is punishment. And we have to think about from one society to another, from one time period to another, what are the sort of the rationales for punishing individuals who have committed crimes. And we'll talk about how those have changed from time to time, place to place, as well as wanting to remind us that they're always the backbone of a lot of our correctional philosophies. We'll wrap up this lecture by taking a look at a major sort of rationale shift that we saw take place over the last century, or roughly the last century here in America. And we'll sort of talk about how we can see that as a good example, as a change in sort of the rationales for punishment, a change in our correctional approach, and how that has impacted the system as a whole. The readings that will correspond to this particular lecture are chapters 1 and chapter 4 of your course textbook. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So what does the term corrections mean? Well, here's a definition straight out of your course textbook. So they define corrections as the variety of programs, services, facilities, and organizations responsible for the management of individuals who have been accused or convicted of criminal offenses. Okay, so quite a mouthful there. But the big takeaway that we want to see here are a few points. First of all is to remind ourselves that at corrections, whether we refer to it as corrections, like as a single word, or if you hear the term thrown around the correctional system, usually these are synonymous with one another. But we want to remind ourselves of that when we say the correctional system, that there's a reason for that, because it's not simply the prisons, it's not simply the jails, it's not simply the courts. The corrections in the correctional system encompass a wide variety of different agencies, various components of law enforcement, and various components of punishment in the jails and the prisons. And then also we have to think about all the community-based programs, halfway houses, reentry centers, things of that nature that also are part of this larger correctional system. So the first thing is we want to think about just how broad and wide this thing is that we're talking about. And two, we want to think about who are the clientele, who are the focus in the field of corrections or the correctional system. And we want to remind ourselves that it's their primary focus historically has been on individuals who have been accused or convicted of criminal offenses. But as we'll talk about here in a few moments, because of just how broad the correctional system is, it's not just those accused and those convicted of crimes that are actually a part of it. All of society is impacted by the correctional system, and we'll see that here in just a second. Now, this very broad correctional system that we will be delving into and talking about this semester, at its core, is sort of focused on balancing two primary goals. The first is to mete out punishment, right? And ideally for that punishment to be fair, not to be biased, not to be too harsh, not to be lenient, but fair punishment where the punishment meets the crime. So one of the major things that the correctional system is always trying to do is they handle, well, how do we punish individuals effectively? And we'll see whether sometimes that may be as simple as probation. Maybe it's a fine. Maybe it's a short jail term. Maybe it's a longer prison term. Maybe there are certain treatment and rehabilitation programs that are part of that punishment. But on the other side of these two goals, the flip side, we have the necessity of trying to protect the community. And yes, some people may say, well, if we just lock up all the criminals, we're protecting society. Not necessarily. As we will talk about going forward in this course, there is only so much physical space that we have available for locking up offenders. So even if we wanted to lock up all the offenders, it's almost impossible. And then two, to mete out fair punishment, eventually the vast majority, well over 95% of people who even enter the prison system, are going to be released back into society someday. And so the correctional system also wants to make sure that as individuals are released back into society, that society is protected from them and they're protected from society. It goes both ways. So how do we prepare individuals to reenter society? And how do we prepare society for their reentry? And then if we even go even further, when we think about protecting the community, it's not just protecting potential victims, but think about families. Many offenders are part of a family unit. They may be somebody who is helping to pay rent. They may have been a parent. And whenever we take them away from that family unit may struggle. So as you can see, the tentacles and the reaches of the correctional system are very broad. And with all this being said, because of the wide nature of the correctional system and how wide and broad it is, as well as the necessity of trying to meet these two goals, we have to always think of the correctional system as a system. So why do I keep stressing the word system? Well, think about a classic system where there's input, throughput, output, right? Our digestive system, the way we eat, right? We eat food to get energy, to get the calories we need, to build muscle, to, things of that nature. So that's the input. The throughput is how our body digests it, right? And if we bring in the right food, we during that throughput, it impacts our body by giving us energy, by helping to build muscle mass, keeping us healthy. But if we put the wrong input in, then you can imagine sometimes it may make us feel sluggish or tired or actually harm our system. And then not to get too graphic with the output, but the output is also going to be impacted by what you put into your body, how your body processes it is also going to determine the output. And the same thing when we think about the correctional system. Anything that enters the correctional system is going to have an impact on the system itself, as well as all the various agencies and components of the system. And so it's impossible for us to ever say, oh, let's fix prisons without thinking about the impact on society, the impact on courts, the impacts on jails, and so forth, right? Or if we say, let's fix the jails, or let's fix the court system, all these things. Anytime we target or tinker with one part of this larger system, it will have ripple effects to other areas of that overall system. So to function as a system, the correctional system must recognize sort of four main things. First is this concept of interconnectedness. And this is what I was getting at on the previous slide. The idea that whenever we change the processes or policies at one point in the system, it will have an impact on the other parts. Just over the last decade or so, California was facing a major prison crisis of overcrowding. And in 2007, 2008, there was a major push within the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to reduce prison crowding. So much so that the U.S. Supreme Court got involved, and a panel of federal judges sort of took over and were the overseers of our state prison system for quite a while. And we'll talk more about all of this in much more detail at a later date. But the takeaway is this: we needed to reduce prison overcrowding. And so there were various ideas put forth. And one of those that sort of stuck was this idea to start having what they called non-violent, non-sexual, non-habitual offenders serve their felony sentences in county jails instead of state prisons. And the idea was, well, if we stop sending so many people to our state prisons, that will help to reduce the overall crowding. Sounded like a good fix. But the problem was we still needed to figure out where to send those individuals. And so we started sending them to the county jails. Well, sure enough, what we've seen over the last decade is that our county jails have seen changes in the dynamics, the types of offenders who are serving time there, um, overcrowding for them, and in it are a lack of resources, right? Because if you have people serving multiple year sentences in a jail that was typically designed for only holding people up to 1 year, and now you have people serving up to 3 years in these county facilities, they don't necessarily have the resources necessary to accommodate those individuals and all the extra needs that come with them. So that gives you an idea of this interconnectedness. We tried to change the prisons and reduce prison overcrowding, but we're seeing ripple effects at our county jails. We're also seeing other ripple effects within our communities that we'll talk about in more detail later. Now, a second thing we need to recognize when thinking about the correctional system as a quote-unquote system is the environment, right? We always have to remember that how we punish individuals, how we handle our correctional system is going to impact our larger environment, our community environments, our social environments, and vice versa. The way that our environments behave will have an impact on how we think about the corrections and how we approach our correctional system, right? If we are only building prisons in certain regions of the state, think about the impact that might have on the local environment. It may provide jobs, but also it may create sort of a certain stigma to those areas if there are, prisons, and that's sort of, a prison environment in that area. We want to think about whenever we talk about punishments that allow offenders to enter into the community to perhaps work during the day or try to get job skills training. That type of correctional approach is going to impact the social environment of the communities where those offenders are at. Also, going back to the idea of just locking people up, right? When we take individuals out of society and we lock them up in jail or prison, that's going to impact their families. That's going to impact their employers that they may have been working for. That has an impact on the environment. And so all these things go back and forth. Also, when we think about environment, we might think about the political environment, right? When we see different political pushes for either lock them all up or on the opposite side, release them and treat them, and we see different types of, flows with what is popular politically, that creates an environment that will have an impact on the correctional system too, because they need to respond to what the political pulse of the city, the county, the state, the nation is at any point in time. And the third thing about any system, go back to your body and your digestive system. I imagine most of us, once again, not trying to be too graphic, but most of us have probably had a meal or two in our lives where it sounded good at the time and we enjoyed this meal, and maybe an hour or two later we realize, ooh, that may not have been the best meal for me. Maybe it was a little spicy. Maybe it was a little rich. Who knows? But maybe your body gives you feedback. Maybe you feel very full. Maybe you have stomach issues. Maybe it makes you feel, other types of ways that are not necessarily comfortable. And that's your body providing feedback saying, nope, please don't enter that into the system again. Or maybe if you're eating healthy and in a correct manner, you're starting to go, wow, my body is giving me feedback that's saying, thank you, I have energy now, I feel better, things of that nature. The same thing goes for the correctional system. In order to know whether or not our correctional system is functioning properly, we are always on the lookout for feedback. But unfortunately, with the correctional system, the system hears more negative feedback than positive feedback, right? When our jails are running effectively, and when our prisons are running effectively, when our rehabilitation programs are running effectively, we don't hear a lot of front page news headlines about the successes of locking up criminals, protecting the public, things of that nature. Rather, think about what makes the nightly news. What makes your news feed on whatever sort of, source that you get your news. It's not necessarily that our prisons are doing well. No. Sadly, it's when we hear about corruption, when we hear about mistakes, when we hear about escapes, when we hear about mistreatment of offenders. we hear that negative feedback more often than we hear the positive feedback. And it's one thing that for those of us working in this field, we have to keep that in mind and make sure that we can still remain objective and enter into assessing the effectiveness of our correctional system, knowing that we're more likely to hear sort of the naysayers or the negative feedback more so than when we're doing well. It's almost no news is good news. Silence is the best thing we can hope for. And finally, when we think about what we need to recognize when we think about the correctional quote unquote system, is the increasing complexity we see. One of the things that is great about technology is it's brought us the opportunity to do electronic monitoring, GPS monitoring. We can connect more resources via radio and internet and things of that nature. Databases can be combined and shared with one another. The complexity of all these things that we see in the correctional system are great. But with complexity also becomes an increasing need for specialization, meaning you need that person who knows how to work with various data sources in order to connect the county level data with the state level data, etc. You need the person who knows how to understand and analyze various electronic monitoring or GPS systems. And with that specialization, we also notice that there are fewer people who know the whole story. There are fewer people who know exactly how the system runs and how all the various pieces are connected. And so that can be a threat to the overall functioning of the system, is if you don't have very many people who know the whole story. And if everyone only works in their own little cubicle, then things can fall through the cracks, mistakes can be made, etc. And we'll provide some examples of those sort of things falling through the cracks due to sometimes being overly complex in how we roll out the correctional system, and how that can impact offenders, people working in corrections, and society itself. So now we're going to shift a little bit away from sort of the idea of what is corrections and what is the thing called the correctional system. And we're going to step back and look back in time and think, well, why do we punish people in the first place? And whether we are talking about 2021, whether we're talking about in the 1960s, or whether we're talking about the 800s, no matter where we look in time, as we look across cultures, societies, and time periods, there have been reasons why a society chooses to punish lawbreakers or chooses to punish criminals. And those reasons are typically guided by the societal beliefs of the time. So what do I mean by that? Well, questions like, why does crime occur? If a society believed that crime occurs because when individuals make some sort of rational choice to engage in crime because they think they're going to get more bang for their buck than going to school and getting a legitimate job, and they have sort of this idea that crime occurs due to a rational calculus, that would impact about how you might punish and why you might punish. Whereas if you think crime occurs because there are certain psychological or biological deficits within certain individuals, and individuals who have those traits are more likely to engage in crime than individuals who do not have those traits, that may play into how you choose to punish. Who is responsible, right? I mean, it's one of those things, does all the burden fall on the actual offender? If so, that may guide how and why you punish. However, if you believe that society may play some role and have some responsibility when it comes to determining who ends up becoming a criminal, who is labeled a criminal, who follows a life of crime and who doesn't, then maybe our approach and rationale for punishment might be slightly different. And then finally, the question of how do we stop crime? It's one of those things. Do you think that individuals are smart enough and rational enough that if they are taught the lesson, and we'll use like the word deterrence here in a few moments, that they eventually are deterred from crime or sort of persuaded not to do it from a sort of rational point, that might influence how we punish individuals? Or do you think that it's impossible to stop people from engaging in crime, and all we can do is lock up the bad ones and keep the rest of society free and safe from those quote unquote criminals? That may have an impact on the type of rationale that you use. So let's take a look at what sort of these questions have led us to over time. And for the most part, most scholars would agree that there are pretty much 5 primary rationales for punishment that we see sort of popping up and existing across cultures, across societies, across time periods. Now, sometimes more than one of these rationales may be in work at any point in time, but usually we can think of and sort of identify a combination of one or more of these 5 rationales that we're going to take a look at now. Arguably, the oldest rationale for punishment is retribution. And before I even lay out the definition and some examples of it, retribution is, think back to when you were a kid on the playground. You're in elementary school, and another kid comes and throws sand in your face, or pushes you over, or throws a dodgeball at you or something and hits you. You get that initial moment of anger, right? You feel the blood rushing through you, and you're going, I have been hurt by this person, and I feel that that person needs to be hurt in return. That's it. In essence, that's retribution. It's almost very at the core of our human sort of psyche. This idea that when I'm hurt, I want to respond and hurt back to the individual or the entity that harmed me in the first place. And so we see retribution. Oftentimes the argument is that it is referred to as deserved punishment. Somebody punished an individual or punished society, therefore they deserve punishment themselves. So we hear terms like an eye for an eye, just deserts, things of that nature that have popped up across different cultures over time periods and sort of are indicators of this rationale of retribution as being a justification for why certain people need to be punished. And in essence, it comes down to this. If you have infringed upon the rights of others, so you deserve to be penalized, period. There's no other moral argument about it. There's no focus on, am I going to stop you from doing it again? Am I going to rehabilitate you and treat you? Am I going to force you or encourage you to give back to the victims that you've harmed? No, there's none of that. It's very straightforward. Retribution is very straightforward. You have hurt somebody, therefore you deserve to be punished. And as I mentioned earlier, it is arguably the oldest rationale amongst the 5 primary rationales. And one of the things that we see, especially within the correctional system, is the argument that if you take a retribution approach for punishment, that the severity of the sanction, the severity of the punishment, should fit the seriousness of the crime, right? You should not over-punish. If somebody walks into a liquor store and robs the clerk for $100, their punishment should match their crime. It should match the fact that they've taken $100. It should match the fact that they probably put fear into the heart and mind of that clerk who was working. It should match the fact that they engaged in theft and robbery. So whatever the punishment is, it should be sort of chosen to match the severity of the crime. And we see that this is tied into what we call, for those of you who have taken a theory class, you're probably familiar with names like Beccaria, Jeremy Bentham, etc., and the classical school of thought, which was really based in the idea that individuals are rational human beings, and therefore if we punish them, one of the things is it's deserved. And then it will also tie into our next rationale, which is deterrence. So as I just alluded to, our second rationale sort of flows from retribution. So retribution simply said, you've harmed somebody, you've harmed a victim, therefore you should be punished in a like manner. Well, and it kind of stops there. we take that a step further and we think, well, what might be a rationale for doing that? What may be more than simply punishing for the sake of punishment? What may we get out of this punishment? And that's where deterrence grows from. And deterrence brings into this idea that if individuals are, for the most part, rational human beings who want to live a life where they have more pleasure than pain, get more benefits than bad things, then they should sort of navigate their life to maximize pleasure, maximize good, and avoid pain and things of that nature. So deterrence says that we will punish individuals now to affect future behavior. So the idea is if you cheat, well, let's not say cheat. Let's say that once again, let's go back to being a kid in elementary school. And let's say you're in 5th grade and you go to the corner, store with your friend, and you don't have the money to buy a Snickers bar, but you see that Snickers bar and you really want that Snickers bar, and you think about all the good things that Snickers bar may bring to your taste buds in your tummy if you can have it. So you decide to steal it because you're hoping that if you get away with it, all the pleasures you're going to have from that Snickers bar. Well, deterrence says once we catch you, we should punish you. Why? Not just because you stole the Snickers bar, but also we want to change your future behavior. We don't want you to steal a Snickers bar next week, or a box of Snickers bars the following week, or hijack a whole truckload of Snickers bars or something like that, right? We need to stop your criminal behavior now. And so the idea is with deterrence is that if we punish you and the punishment is just harsh enough, the next time you're faced with the opportunity to take that Snickers bar, you'll go, ooh, I remember the likelihood of that punishment and I don't want to go through that again. So I'm going to go home and get money and come back and buy the Snickers bar later because that's the right thing to do. And therefore, deterrence has changed your behavior. By punishing you for stealing the Snickers now, we hope to avoid you stealing them in the future. And deterrence can also be broken down into sort of 2 general categories. Now, both of these still, the focus is on punishing offenders now to affect future behavior, but the key difference between general and specific deterrence is whose future behavior do you want to impact? General deterrence says, let's punish an offender now, and hopefully the punishment of that one offender will send a message to the entire community that if you do that type of crime, you're going to face a certain type of punishment, and the message goes out to the entire community. And the community, so even individuals who never wanted to steal a Snickers bar, never thought of it, heard about the punishment the fifth grader received and go, I'm not even going to bother ever trying to steal a Snickers bar. That's general deterrence. When by simply punishing one person, you're kind of making an example of that person in hopes of sending a larger message about proper behavior to the larger community or society as a whole. Specific deterrence is much more focused. Specific deterrence is focusing only on that offender. So going back to the 5th grader who stole the Snickers bar, specific deterrence says if I punish Johnny now for stealing that Snickers bar, then I'm sending a message to Johnny. And hopefully Johnny will learn from his lesson and he will not repeat his criminal behavior in the future. So that's specific deterrence. So general deterrence is trying to send a message to the entire community. Specific deterrence is trying to send a message specifically to that one offender. And deterrence, as I've mentioned in passing on the last slide, also ties into that classical school of thought, right? Whereas the idea that if we have punishments that fit the crime, then a rational human being will say, you know what? If the likelihood of being punished is pretty certain and the punishment comes swiftly, then I don't think I want to engage in that criminal behavior because My life is okay, and I don't need to risk the pain or losses that might incur by engaging in a certain crime. The third focus or third rationale for punishment is incapacitation. So, with the first two, the old ones, retribution and deterrence, you saw the focus was on punishing the offender. Incapacitation has a similar focus. The focus is on punishing the offender. For retribution, we punish the offender for the sake, for sort of just the general feeling of if they've inflicted harm, they deserve harm. For deterrence, the rationale for punishing the offender was sort of based in the idea of sending a message to impact future behavior in order to hopefully sort of get people to not commit crime, sending a message with deterrence. Incapacitation, the focus is on punishing the offender, but as you'll see here in just a second, it's almost with a mindset of, we don't know if we can stop this individual from engaging in crime. This person doesn't seem to be able to be, deterred. They don't seem to be able to be rehabilitated. So we just need to lock them up. We need to keep them away from society, because the only way to protect society is to remove this individual from society. That is at the heart of incapacitation. So at its core, incapacitation is depriving an individual of the ability to commit crimes. So in its truest form, this is locking somebody up in jail or prison. Now, yes, we will talk about later in this course that can people still engage in criminal behavior behind bars? Absolutely. But it's a lot harder to do, and the variety of crimes that you can engage in are much more limited. So by simply locking somebody up and keeping them away from society, in essence, you are depriving them of the ability to commit crimes. And this rationale has been popular during various time periods. As we get deeper into the course, we'll look at some of these, and we'll notice that incapacitation seems to sort of become more popular when there's a spike in crime rates, when there is a surge in crime rates that both the public and the professionals can't seem to explain, and they can't seem to get it under control. And eventually every society kind of throws their arms up and says, you know what, let's just lock them all up. If they're locked up, then they can't harm the rest of society, right? It's almost sort of like at the end, last straw, just saying, let's just lock them up. But as we'll see, locking people up for extended periods of time often doesn't necessarily flow well with the sort of the system as a whole, sort of balance and fairness within the environment, within the system, etc. And what we've seen just in the last 30 years or so was we've seen a lot of the terms similar to selective incapacitation. Oftentimes where individuals can receive harsher sentences or be housed in certain more high security prisons or high security cell blocks because they are the individuals that are most likely to cause harm to society. So therefore, we are selectively choosing who we incapacitate. And this is especially effective when we have limited prison space, limited incarceration space. Even right now, across this country, especially here in California, we still have a problem with prison overcrowding. So there's times when we have, in both our jails and our prisons, we have to figure out who are we going to let out a little bit early, right? So we have to sort of have a selective mindset. And the mindset is often determined by who's the greatest risk to society. Those are the individuals who need to remain incapacitated. As we're seeing the COVID-19 pandemic, that's thrown a whole nother issue into selective incapacitation. Who is the most risk to get sick? Who is the most risk to spread the disease, while also trying to balance fair punishment and protecting society? So you can see a lot of these things start to get very complex very quick. Now, the fourth of the rationales, rehabilitation, changes the focus a little bit. You'll see here the first thing I have noted is that under rehabilitation is this focus on treating offenders more so than punishing, right? When we look at the first three rationales we talked about, retribution, you punish because they deserve to be punished. Deterrence, you punish in order to send a message. Incapacitation, you punish in order to protect the rest of society. Right? The focus on those first three was punish, punish, punish. Focus on the offender. This one, the focus is still primarily on the offender, but the idea is to treat the offender. Rehabilitation and this sort of rationale is a newer, or relatively newer rationale. When I say newer, I mean 120, 130 years new. But in the sake of human timeline, it's relatively new. So rehabilitation sort of came about with the idea that maybe an offender isn't always 100% responsible or culpable for their crimes. Maybe society should take a little bit of responsibility, right? That's one part. Rehabilitation also realizes that unless we plan to lock up people for the rest of their life, they're eventually going to return back to society. So do we want to return somebody who has basically been sort of stunted in their social growth and only been in jail or prison for a period of time with no education or proper socialization? Or do we want to release somebody back into society that has received help for their addictions, helped in their educational skills or job skills that may be lacking? And that's kind of where the focus of rehabilitation is realization people can only be punished for so long, so why don't we try to help them or fix them, if you think about it that way, before they return to society? And at the core of it is the argument that by selecting the appropriate type of education or therapy, job skills training, etc., that can restore a person to a constructive place in society. And you'll see here, I started here with the word appropriate type of education or therapy, because one of the biggest sort of, I would say, Achilles heels for rehabilitation is people often target that we don't properly focus our rehabilitation efforts. Right? If everyone who goes into a certain prison is forced to take the same educational classes, the same therapy programs, the same job skills training, that's not proper rehabilitation, right? Because not everyone needs the same thing. So in order for rehabilitation to be effective, one of the key things is we need to have individuals from a whole bunch of different backgrounds and society as a whole working to identify what are the true needs for each individual offender, and then what component of society is best suited to help them with that. And that's once again where we come back to sort of this interconnected nature of the correctional system. And as we'll wrap up in a few slides, we'll come back to this idea about the popularity of rehabilitation. But here in the United States, rehabilitation was very popular during a large part of the 1900s. So pretty much from the early 1900s, teens, 20s, up until the 1970s, this rationale really dominated a large chunk of our correctional system and our policies and laws that we had in place. And when we think about rehabilitation, it's often tied to what are known as indeterminate sentences. And we'll talk more about the good and the bad and the ugly of indeterminate sentences. But for today, at least on the surface, indeterminate sentences within the prison or jail system is when somebody is sentenced to, say, a prison term, not for 5 years, but rather they may be sentenced for, say, 2 to 12 years, a very open-ended period of time. And the goal there is that individual will be released once we, quote unquote, we feel that they have been rehabilitated. And then we'll talk more about that proverbial we and parole boards and who exactly makes those decisions going forward. But for right now, that's sort of the spirit of indeterminate sentences. And finally, of our 5 rationales, arguably the newest is restorative justice. Now, restorative justice also takes a step further, whereas the first 3 were all about retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, were about punishing the offender for various end goals. And then rehabilitation was about treating the offender. Restorative justice sort of breaks the focus and says, let's not just focus solely on the offender, whether it's punishment or treatment. Restorative justice says we need to recognize that crime and criminal behavior is not simply one offender, one victim. And in fact, the larger community, the larger society are responsible, and the larger community, larger society are also impacted by crime. And therefore, in order for us to sort of heal everyone, it needs to have more of a community focus. And you'll see that when we talk more in more depth about restorative justice. And at the core of it is that crime is more than a violation of law or infliction of harm on one person. And therefore, punishment should focus on the repairing the harm done to the entire community. If you think about it, somebody engages in crime. Somebody robs one person on the street. Now, yes, there was one offender, one victim, but what led that offender to that place in that moment, at that time, right? Are there certain things that maybe there were community or society was responsible for the path that that offender took to get them there and to resort to crime? For the victim, even if they get away and the offender is apprehended, the victim is going to be scarred by just the experience. Even if they get their money back, they're still going to have the memories, which will have a lasting impact on them. The community will also be impacted, right? If all of a sudden it starts to send a message that this particular neighborhood is prone to crime, it may impact businesses, and businesses may suffer. Other community members who hear about this robbery that took place, all of a sudden they may have extra fear for their safety, their family's safety. They may change their behaviors, right? So you can see these tentacles reaching out from one single crime that sort of impact the entire society. And restorative justice says that's why we need to bring everyone to the table in order to really find the best path forward for both punishment and healing for the offender, for the victim, for society as a whole. Ideally, everyone should play a role in the process. It shouldn't simply be a prosecutor filing charges and then a court case going on and a judge and a jury determining a punishment and a level of guilt and then somebody being shipped off to prison for their punishment. No. Restorative justice says that ideally, we need to bring together victims in the community to work with offenders, to let the offenders know how their behavior impacted them. Let the offenders share their point of view about what led them down that road. And then all parties involved work towards figuring out what would be the best sort of way for everyone to learn and heal going forward. Whether it's community service, whether it's therapy, whether it is speaking in certain engagements, whether it's restitution and fines, who knows? But restorative justice really has that focus that let's focus less on the punishment and focus not just on treating the offender, but treating and healing society as a whole. On these next few slides, I just want you to sit back. I'm going to briefly describe 3 different sort of laws or policies that have occurred here in the United States, and heavy focus on California over the last couple decades. And just think about, of those 5 rationales that we talked about, which 1 or 2 do you think are really sort of guiding each one of these laws or policies? So our first example is California's 3 strikes law. This was one of many habitual offender laws that took place and popped up in many states across the nation, specifically during the 1990s. In California, it was Proposition 184. In 1994, it was actually a ballot initiative or ballot proposition. And sort of the feeling of the public in California was sort of fed up with rising crime in our cities, gang-related crime, youth-related crime, gun and drug-related crime. And there was a push for, being a little bit harsher as far as how we handled responses to criminal behavior. And this 3 strikes law passed with a 72% majority in 1994. And much more detail, and it's gone through various iterations over the years, but in a nutshell, after the third serious felony conviction, an offender faces life imprisonment. Right? So you've probably heard this: one strike, two strike, three strikes, right? Once you have three strikes, you're facing life imprisonment. Now, that doesn't mean that third strike doesn't necessarily have to be the worst crime you've ever committed or even necessarily by itself worthy of life imprisonment. But the argument here is, hey, by the third time, you didn't get the message, so we're locking you up for good. And in fact, California's has been argued as one of the strictest three strikes laws in the United States. And we'll go into a little more detail moving forward in this course, but that kind of gives you an overview of it, in its infancy and how it was initially came about in 1994. And you think about it, okay, what was the rationale for this? For me, if I had to think, I clearly see a strong push for deterrence and incapacitation. Right? This idea of you have three chances before you get your third strike. So that goes in that idea of deterrence, and the idea that, well, we think if you don't learn by your third time, then you're never going to learn, then it's worth punishing you. Incapacitation, the idea that maybe people who have committed three strikes, they're the bad seeds. They're not going to get any better, so society would be better off by simply locking them up. You don't hear, at least what we see on this page, you don't hear a whole lot of rehabilitation or restorative justice or really even retribution, just simple punishing for the sake of punishment, do you? This is definitely one that I would argue, and you could have your different arguments, where we see quite a bit of deterrence and incapacitation sort of fueling a law like this. A second law we'll look at real quickly was the Federal Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. Now, one component of this act specifically focused on and made sort of a divide between sort of powdered cocaine and crack or rock cocaine. And during this time in the 1980s, we saw a proliferation of cocaine use and then the rising use of this adulterated, cheaper form of cocaine called crack cocaine, which was much cheaper to produce, much cheaper to get your hands on, but also created a much more intense, short-lived high. And to make matters worse, we found when you looked across the demographics of users, powdered cocaine, which was much more expensive, seemed to be found much more commonly used in more affluent parts of society, whereas crack cocaine was found in much more poverty-stricken areas. So you can already start to see different things coming into play with it. And this Federal Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 put this into place. Conviction for possession or distribution of 5 grams of crack cocaine equaled a mandatory 5-year sentence in prison. So 5 grams of crack cocaine is not a very large quantity of this new rock crack cocaine. But if you were found possession or distribution, mandatory 5-year sentence in prison. A pretty harsh punishment. And people may go, well, I don't know how to compare it to anything else. Let's take a look at how it compared versus that powdered cocaine that tended to be used by more affluent individuals. It was a 100-to-1 difference as far as the ratio. And what do I mean by that? Well, 5 grams of crack led to 5 years in prison. But in order to get 5 years in prison for powdered cocaine, you would have to have 100 times that amount. 500 grams of powdered cocaine in order to receive the mandatory 5-year sentence. So what we see here, obviously, is we have some inequality. And many of the people who pushed for this said, well, we fear that crack cocaine is more of an epidemic, especially for our inner cities. It's targeting more poverty-stricken individuals. People of all segments of society are able to get their hands on it. And therefore, we think it's also connected with rising use of weapons and gangs and blah, blah, blah. And therefore, we're punishing it. On the other hand, many people looked at this and said, this is basically a prejudicial law where you are targeting a certain segment of society in a much stricter fashion, and the more affluent segment of society is not facing this type of punishment, right? So when we think about the rationales, one of the things we might say is this deterrence? Or is it more incapacitation? Is there somewhere, if we read between the lines, an effort to try to lock up a certain segment of society while kind of turning a blind eye to a different segment of society? And then finally, we have what is known as SB 1453. More commonly known, we'll use things like this, like SBs and ABs followed by a number. For those of you who aren't familiar, SB just stands for Senate bill. If we see A, it's an assembly bill. So these are various bills that are brought forth up in, at least in California, up in Sacramento by our state legislature, and then can have an impact on changing policies and laws. So SB 1453, Senate Bill 1453, passed in California in 2007. And what this did was, this was a focus on trying to help individuals who had a substance abuse problem. And so what it would mandate was individuals who were identified as having a substance abuse problem, who were in prison, they would go through a 90-day in-prison sort of rehabilitation program. If they completed that, they would then be sent to 150 days of residential substance abuse aftercare when they were released from prison. So rather than simply being released from prison, going to wherever they were planned to live, and then being on parole, they were sent immediately to sort of a halfway house. Usually like some sort of like renovated, hotel or apartment complex or something of that nature in the county where they were returning to. And they would live there, still being monitored and watched, and they would receive substance abuse aftercare, also help with job finding, things of that nature. And then if the participants who went into this program made successful progress during these 150 days, at the end of those 150 days, they would actually be discharged from parole. So it's sort of a carrot. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this time period, in 2007 in California, virtually every single individual who came out of a California state prison was mandated to 3 years of parole supervision. So I'll say it one more time. Almost everyone who came out of a state prison in California was mandated to 3 years of parole supervision. And if they were unable to make it 3 years without getting rearrested or reconvicted or having a parole violation, then they may get sent back to prison, or they may have their parole term lengthened, things that we'll talk about in more detail later. But for individuals who were eligible for SB 1453, as you can see, the idea was rather than having 3 years of parole, if you successfully completed this program, you would only have what? Roughly 5 months of parole. And then you would be eligible after 150 days to be a completely free man or woman, no longer under correctional supervision. So it sounds like a great idea. However, it didn't sell quite as well with a lot of the offenders, and we'll have a lecture about this later in the semester to talk about it. But for today, the idea is, so what's the rationale for this one? This one, I would hope, is one of the few that we're seeing a little bit of that sort of that rehabilitation component, right? We're offering them an opportunity to better themselves, to go into extra aftercare after being released from prison and receive help for 150 days. One, with the opportunity to potentially get off parole sooner, and two, to get help. There's also a little bit of restorative justice. As we'll talk about later, many of these programs work to connect offenders with their family members or with former employers or the communities that they were part of in order for everyone to sort of heal and come together in a positive way. And finally, we will wrap up this lecture briefly talking about something else that we'll go into much more detail in future lectures, but just to sort of put out there, the American shift in rationales over roughly the last 100 years. So in the United States, most of the 1900s saw what we'd call a rehabilitative approach in corrections, especially within our prison systems. We saw almost every state, as well as the District of Columbia, had indeterminate sentencing laws. And these indeterminate sentencing laws, as I alluded to before, were not mandatory minimums or fixed sentences. Rather, people were sent to prison with a pretty wide range of time. And in order to determine how they would be released or when they would be released from prison, individuals would go before a parole board every few years to see whether or not they had met certain criteria to show that, in fact, that they were receiving treatment and, in fact, that they had been, quote unquote, rehabilitated. And so the idea of it and the philosophy of it sounded positive. You were as soon, those who rehabilitated quicker could be released quicker. Those who needed more time would stay in prison longer. And the idea was, we are going to keep you locked up for the time that is necessary for treatment. Now, this sounds good on paper. However, as will be seen in more detail in lectures to come, there are always two sides to every story, right? One of the things we'll start to realize is that there was potential too much discretion by these parole boards as far as who they felt was rehabilitated, who they felt was not rehabilitated, right? So we see racial discrepancies. We see socioeconomic discrepancies in how parole boards released or kept people locked up over time. There's questions about sort of the efficacy of these closed meetings with parole boards and what was really going on. Was it transparent with how they were making their decisions? So you have those arguments against it. You also had another side of the political spectrum that looked at this rehabilitative approach and said, we're coddling these offenders. We're being too nice. They're criminals. They don't deserve treatment. They don't deserve help. They don't deserve education. They should just simply be locked up and be left there to wither away. So both sides of the political spectrum started to eventually start to look at this rehabilitative approach and go, I don't know if we like it too much. And sure enough, if we think about the early 1970s, the civil rights era, sure enough, everything came to a boil. Both sides of the political spectrum started to question the validity and approach of rehabilitation. And it culminated in an article published by Robert Martinson in 1974, which in a simple sense pretty much reported that from his findings, he argued that rehabilitative efforts that have been reported so far have no appreciable effect on recidivism. So in other words, Martinson came out with this paper in 1974 that said, all we've been trying to do to rehabilitate offenders and to help them and to treat them is worthless. And we're wasting our time. And he happened to publish this paper at the perfect political moment when both left-leaning liberals and right-leaning conservatives, for different reasons, still said, yep, we agree. We don't like this, so let's change it. And everything came tumbling down after there. And arguably one of the biggest correctional shifts we have ever seen in America took place in the 1970s during this time period. So following sort of debates about the efficacy of rehabilitation and the publishing of Robert Martinson's article, California, along with many other states in the Union, started to change from indeterminate sentencing laws to determinate sentencing laws. In California, we changed officially in 1977. And what that meant was, by changing to determinate sentencing, was it was no longer an open window of time that somebody may be sentenced to prison, and then you'd have this parole board who would convene to see whether or not they were worthy of release. No. Rather, it was the day that the judge handed down the sentence that you could use a calculator to figure out exactly when somebody was going to be released. It was not a 2 to 10 year sentence. No. It was a 5-year sentence, or whatever it was, 7-year sentence. And then everything else was mathematical. Offenders were no longer encouraged to participate in treatment or rehabilitation. And you might see where this is going to lead us as far as rationales and some of the impacts that we saw in California and the US from the 1970s up until now. This changed so that we lost the impetus for treatment and rehabilitation. We lost funding for treatment and rehabilitation. Offenders knew exactly when they would get out. And it was, you would have your sentence, and then you might get out a couple days early for quote unquote good time, something we'll talk about later. You might have time added on to your sentence for quote unquote bad time, things of that nature. But it was very simple and it took any sort of discretion out of the picture. So in some ways it sounded good because you didn't have the opportunity for prejudice or people making faulty judgments, but you also lost a lot of sort of the human impact and the rationales for treatment and receiving help. And then the 1970s switched towards determinate sentencing, rippled into the 1980s with more what we call determinate sentencing, mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing, 3 strikes laws, a lot of things you may have heard of that we'll talk more about. And so the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s saw this rapid push for tough on crime. Lock them up, make sure they serve their full sentence. Things of that nature was sort of the rhetoric across the land. But it also led to one of the biggest prison spikes as far as population goes that this country has ever seen. And we'll see that in an upcoming lecture. By around the mid-2000s and 2007, at least in California, we realized that, maybe we've gone a little bit too far. Maybe the pendulum needs to swing back a little bit, and we need to start bringing rehabilitation back in. And what many people argue was merely a symbolic effort, but it was an effort nonetheless. Under the Arnold Schwarzenegger administration in 2007, California renamed its Department of Corrections to the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation in an effort to start to find a better balance between punishment and treatment. And here we are 13, 14 years later, and we're still trying to play out what is the best approach for punishment. And it's something that we will talk about throughout the rest of this semester. And one of the things you'll see me sort of equate it to is a pendulum that continually is swinging back and forth, looking for the perfect answer. And there probably isn't a perfect answer when it comes to corrections, mainly because of the human element that's involved. But also, it doesn't mean that we ever should stop looking for things that work at the right time in the right place. So that's been a rather long one. Trust me, most of the lectures will not go this long. But this is one that I want to kind of make sure you heard some of the key terms and concepts that we'll be hearing throughout the rest of the semester and kind of give you an idea of where we're going forward. So I'll wrap it up there, and I will see you at the next lecture. Take care.